In the very heart of ancient Rome, where political intrigue and hedonistic pleasures converged, events unfolded that left an indelible mark on the course of history. But what truly transpired behind the scenes of these lavish feasts, where eroticism and strategic thinking intertwined in a complex knot? Sexual orgies in ancient Rome were not merely acts of private indulgence. They possessed a profound political subtext. They served as a means to demonstrate power, solidify political alliances, and assert who held true dominance. This exploration will delve into how such gatherings became effective instruments of influence, transforming sexuality not only into an object of desire, but also into a symbol of status and control. Ancient Roman society was characterized by a rigid hierarchical structure, where every action, every word, and even every fleeting desire played a vital role in maintaining the established order. Far from being a private matter, sexuality was subject to stringent social norms and served as a distinct language for demonstrating status, power, and mastery. In Rome, pleasures were not forbidden, yet they always remained within clearly defined boundaries. Desires could be satisfied, but only under the watchful eye of the established hierarchy. Free citizens of high standing could indulge in sensual delights, but they were simultaneously obliged to uphold their image as powerful and influential individuals. The guiding principle was clear: a Roman man must always dominate, never submit. Thus, sexuality became a strategic weapon. Ceasing to be a simple act of attraction, it transformed into a statement of power and control, a game extending far beyond mere intimacy. Power was manifested not only through control over weaponry, but also through the subjugation of another's body. The debauched revelries of ancient Rome were not unique. Similar rites can be found in other ancient civilizations, albeit with different motivations and aims. In ancient Greece, for instance, symposia were banquets offering abundant food, wine, and conversation, yet they also served to honor the gods and discuss matters of state. In the Roman Empire, however, such entertainments adopted a far more strategic orientation. While the Greeks employed sensual pleasures to celebrate fertility and art, the Romans transformed these gatherings into a tool for bolstering political and social influence. In ancient Egypt, fertility rituals were similarly intertwined with power. But in Rome, eroticism became a distinctive visual and symbolic language through which the authority of free citizens from the upper echelons of society was asserted. Thus, pleasure evolved from mere entertainment into a public demonstration of high social standing. The Romans not only adopted these traditions but also adapted them to their own hierarchical system, utilizing the body as a means of displaying power, rather than solely for carnal gratification. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, whose name is inextricably linked to the decline of the Roman Republic and his relentless pursuit of power, was among the first to institutionalize these hedonistic and authoritative gatherings. In an attempt to solidify his hegemony, Sulla introduced what became known as feasts of abundance to the Roman aristocracy. These celebrations were far more than just lavish meals. Every aspect of these events was meticulously orchestrated to accentuate the host's omnipotence. Drawing inspiration from Hellenistic traditions, Sulla combined exquisite food and wine with erotic performances, sensual dances, and the company of professional courtesans. Such occasions represented a curious blend of entertainment and humiliation. Guests not only indulged in pleasures, but also witnessed spectacles that reinforced the social hierarchy, vividly demonstrating who held power, who wielded it, and who made the decisions. Roman sexual revelries were not random improvisations, but meticulously planned celebrations intended for an exclusive elite circle, where every detail held profound meaning. These gatherings took place in secluded and exclusive venues, hidden from the prying eyes of ordinary citizens, whether country villas or opulent urban residences, often adorned with frescoes and mosaics of an erotic nature. Country villas, in particular, offered an atmosphere of privacy ideal for such events. They featured secluded gardens, private pools, and halls whose walls were painted with explicit scenes, some of which survive today in Pompeii and Herculaneum. These frescoes depicted gods, satyrs, and nymphs in provocative poses, serving as a visual embodiment of carnal desires and fertility, accessible only to the most powerful. These luxurious feasts were predominantly attended by men of high social standing, senators, military commanders, and government officials. Accompanied by musicians, attendants, and experienced courtesans, these events skillfully interwoven pleasure and influence, delighting those gathered with sensual dances and audacious performances that carried an unambiguous message. Dominance and control were fundamental to the Roman nobility. These festivities were not merely a way to indulge in pleasures, but also an arena where power was openly displayed. Every movement, every glance, every utterance served a specific purpose: to reinforce the social structure, to emphasize who held authority and who was subordinate. Eroticism transformed into a silent language, a means to demonstrate status, humiliate adversaries, or attract potential supporters. It was a way to exert power, to show that not only the body, but also the future of Rome was under control. At the most exquisite banquets, erotic scenes involving slaves or performers not only captivated the imagination, but also conveyed a clear message: here, the one who organizes, who owns, who decides, rules. Thus, sexuality was far more than a personal act. It was a public spectacle, a constant affirmation of who occupied the pinnacle of the social hierarchy. During the era of Roman feasts, slaves occupied a central position, serving not merely as attendants or spectators, but as key figures in the power scenarios that unfolded. The sexual and social stratification of Roman society was so deeply intertwined with these ceremonial rituals that even slaves became active participants in this complex performance. Slaves tasked with serving at such events were typically skilled courtesans, talented actors, and musicians, perfectly adept at satisfying the expectations of their masters and their guests. Within a system where power was expressed through dominance, these slaves became instruments for the transmission and reinforcement of power and control. However, the relationships with slaves were not exhausted by their participation in spectacular performances. They embodied an element of subjugation, serving as a vivid confirmation of the chasm separating the elite from those considered mere property. The sexual aspect of these events, therefore, was not only a means of obtaining pleasure, but also served as an open demonstration of dominance, where the bodies of slaves were used to affirm the power of free Romans and members of the upper class. With the advent of imperial rule in Rome, sexual festivities took on a new dimension, closely intertwined with the ruler's unlimited authority. What was previously accessible only to select members of the nobility transformed into an open display of imperial might. Emperors such as Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero used these events not only to satisfy personal whims, but also to consolidate their power. In this new reality, feasts ceased to be merely private affairs, becoming spectacular shows where the emperor presented himself to the people as the absolute master not only of his own body, but also of his subjects' bodies. Tiberius, for example, having secluded himself in his villa on Capri, reportedly hosted feasts so profoundly decadent and extreme that even Roman sensibilities seemed offended. There, surrounded by young slaves and courtesans, he elevated eroticism to the status of a political instrument, transforming pleasure into a means of strengthening his power. The abuse of eroticism as a means of demonstrating power reached its zenith during the reign of Caligula. This emperor, renowned for his eccentric antics, used feasts to humiliate his opponents, compelling political figures to attend and thereby demonstrating his comprehensive power over all aspects of Roman life, including the most intimate. While Tiberius and Caligula laid the groundwork for the abuse of power through eroticism, it was Nero who elevated sexual orgies to an unprecedented theatrical and provocative level. The emperor, who reigned from 54 to 68 AD, transformed his entertainments into genuine dramatic productions, permeated with an atmosphere of unbridled desire. He was not content with ordinary feasts. His celebrations spilled into grandiose aquatic processions along the river Tiber, where the emperor appeared before his subjects surrounded by musicians, actors, and courtesans, all engaged in an unrestrained carnival of excess. Luxuriously decorated rafts, resembling floating brothels, served as the ideal stage for an unlimited demonstration of vice, where pleasure became a public spectacle. In addition to these extravagant banquets, Nero staged wedding ceremonies with his lovers, making no distinction between men and women, in the presence of witnesses, and with all necessary rituals observed. In his famous residence, known as the Domus Aurea, he hosted endless feasts where showers of rose petals and perfumes fell from the ceilings, intoxicating guests, while participants indulged in sensual delights without any restrictions. Nero sought not only his own gratification, but also used these actions as a public affirmation of his unlimited power. Eroticism, in his interpretation, served as a tool for asserting his dominance over Rome, where control over the bodies of his subjects transformed into control over the fate of the entire empire. The lavish feasts in ancient Rome, designed to showcase the empire's grandeur and might, served not only as acts of hedonism, but also as crucial political instruments. However, despite their status as symbols of power and luxury, not all Romans shared the enthusiasm for these extravagant spectacles. Within intellectual and philosophical circles, prominent figures like Seneca and Cicero boldly voiced their disapproval, viewing these feasts as signs of deep moral decay within society. Seneca, a proponent of Stoic philosophy, saw these practices as manifestations of corruption that undermined the foundations of self-control and virtue, which he considered the cornerstones of Roman civilization. Cicero, in turn, also condemned these excesses, deeming them a direct threat to public order and traditional Roman values. Criticism did not solely emanate from the intellectual elite. Many Romans from the lower classes considered these banquets outrageous displays of extravagance and inequality. Even senators had to navigate between the necessity of participating in these events to strengthen their position and maintaining a public image consistent with their political role. Nevertheless, despite the criticism, the political significance of these festivities cannot be underestimated. Emperors often used them as a means to consolidate their power, humiliate political opponents, or distract attention from administrative failures. This hypocritical behavior, combining private pleasures and public display, was a constant theme in Roman political discussions. Sexual festivities in ancient Rome extended far beyond mere escapism or personal inclinations. They served as a vivid reflection of the deep contradictions permeating Roman society, which, on the one hand, seemed to permit excesses in the intimate sphere, yet on the other, demanded strict adherence to rigorous moral norms in public life. In a world where honor and discipline were paramount for social well-being, the very individuals who indulged in lavish feasts and sensual pleasures meticulously maintained a public image of virtue, decency, and unwavering honor. Senators, military commanders, and members of noble families could participate in orgies and similar events. However, outside these private gatherings, they were obliged to adhere to strict codes of conduct and uphold an appearance of respectability and self-possession. This striking contrast between private licentiousness and public moral strictness highlights one of the most astonishing features of ancient Rome. While the elite indulged in such excesses, Roman moral principles dictated a dignified public life, leading to the emergence of double standards that persisted throughout the empire's history. Despite the veil of secrecy surrounding Roman sexual festivities, their influence on culture was not confined solely to the upper echelons of society. These celebrations and their associated excesses left an indelible mark on Roman literature, particularly in satirical works and erotic poetry. Authors such as Ovid, Martial, and Petronius not only vividly depicted explicit scenes, but also deeply contemplated the boundaries of permissible desire and moral decay. In their works, Roman writers raised questions not only about pleasures and excesses but also about the social and political consequences of such actions. How far could influential individuals go in their insatiable craving for gratification without losing the remnants of their dignity? How did these intimate acts affect Rome's fragile social and political balance? These pressing questions were debated within the pages of the great Roman masters of words, leading to an ongoing dialogue about morality and pervasive corruption. Thus, eroticism served not merely as a means of escape from harsh reality, but also as a tool for critical reflection and, simultaneously, for affirming the existing social order. Sometimes this occurred openly and provocatively, and at other times, it was veiled and hinted at. As a result, future generations inherited a legacy that extended far beyond the festivities themselves, transforming into an eternal contemplation of power, untamed desire, and moral principles. Although the sexual festivities of ancient Rome may seem like echoes of a bygone era, their instructive aspects retain their significance even today. In many ways, the mechanisms of power, dominance, and desire that define these events are reflected in contemporary society, where sexuality continues to be a means of influence and control in various spheres. Today, the open expression of pleasure, control over the bodies of others, and the pursuit of high status through indulgence in desires are still present in both personal relationships and public discourse. Roman feasts vividly demonstrate that sexuality, extending beyond a personal act, can be used to consolidate power, influence the political arena, and reinforce social hierarchies. Looking to the past, the question arises: to what extent do modern social and political customs reflect ancient Roman rituals? What conclusions can be drawn from how Rome used eroticism to establish control over its citizens and the known world? The sexual feasts in ancient Rome represent more than just the gratification of carnal desires. They were a complex manifestation of power, control, and hierarchy, where pleasure transformed into a political and social instrument, carefully orchestrated to confirm the status of the most influential individuals. Beyond the excessive pomp and theatrical historical depictions, these ancient rituals reveal the essence of Roman society, a relentless struggle for dominance, might, and authority, unfolding not only on battlefields, but also in the intimate corners of everyday life. Today, as we cast our gaze into the past, we cannot help but ponder how the thirst for power and political intrigue intertwine in the most peculiar ways, and how the echoes of these ancient rituals still resonate in contemporary society, albeit in a more veiled form. Understanding the meaning of these celebrations is not merely the satisfaction of idle curiosity, but an appeal to the memory of generations. History, even in its most extravagant manifestations, opens our eyes to who we were and who we remain to this day.